the global supply chain and the industrial engine, driving the fastest naval buildup since World War II. American ingenuity and domestic manufacturing must always be our guide. That is why I introduced H.R. 8615, the Fleets Now Act, that has provisions to increase training for American shipbuilders. If we want to restore balance to the oceans, we need to look to our greatest advantage, our international allies and partners. Specifically, we must forge an aggressive shipbuilding alliance with the world's other maritime heavyweights, South Korea and Japan. By integrating our industrial capacities, we can create a counterweight that Beijing cannot match. This is about leveraging the commercial capacities of Seoul and Tokyo to secure our supply chains and free up American yards for high-end naval combatant production and systematically decouple the free world from China's maritime empire. As the President's Maritime Action Plan lays out, we must aggressively pursue allied foreign direct investment to revitalize our underused domestic shipyards, creating tax incentives for firms like HD Hyundai, Hanwha Ocean, and Imabari to buy, renovate, and operate shipyards on our own American soil. The United States is blessed with an unparalleled network of alliances. If we link American innovation with the industrial muscle of South Korea and Japan, we can and will break Beijing's maritime monopoly. We will rebuild our domestic shipyards, empower our global allies, and ensure that the free world continues to command the seas. Our ranking member, Ami Bera, is here for your opening comments.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And thank you for chairing this hearing. It's an incredibly important topic that we're talking about, and it's not a partisan issue. If we think about our history through World War II, post-World War II, we know how to build ships and so forth. But over the 75, 80 years post-World War II through the Cold War, we've lost some of that industrial capacity. Our shipyards have aged. We've lost a workforce. I've had the chance to visit shipyards around the world. Had the chance to visit Hanwha Ocean's research facility 2 years ago with Congresswoman Kiggins from Virginia, also a Navy veteran. And I think there's a recognition that if we want to compete in the maritime space, both in the commercial maritime space, but also in the naval geostrategic security space, we're going to have to step up our game. I think there's also recognition in a nonpartisan fashion that we have lots of challenges ahead of us. As I mentioned, aging shipyards and a workforce that does not exist at this juncture. We've got capable workers, but not enough of them, and not enough of the next generation going into this line of work. So there's a lot to be done. And as the chairwoman suggested, we're falling further and further behind China. China does have that capacity. They've been very intentional in understanding global security is maritime security. You talk to our staff at INDOPACOM, Admiral Paparo and others recognize the importance. And while we maintain a technological advantage and so forth, we don't have that numerical advantage. And on aircraft carriers and other things, they are rapidly catching up. The beauty is, though, China's doing this alone. And I think the importance of this particular hearing with a focus on some of our friends and allied nations, particularly Korea and Japan, that rank number 2 and number 3 in shipbuilding, we don't have to do this alone. Having talked to the Koreans with the chairwoman, but also having visited Japan and talked to the Japanese, there's great interest in helping the United States build ships. We have to figure out the technical details. We have to understand the resource allocations and the resource certainty so that, I applaud the National Assembly and the Koreans for making the decision to invest $350 billion in the United States, $150 billion of which is allocated to shipbuilding. But we have to create some certainties as well. you want to create those demand signals that say, yes, make those investments here, and here's what we're going to do over the next 25 years to catch up. And we can do this. And again, I think the advantage we have, where China is doing this on their own, we have allies that we can do this with. We have technical issues that we have to work through. Does all the components of the ship need to be built in the United States? Can you build non-critical components, non-technical components elsewhere in Japan or Korea? Do final installation here in the United States? Again, none of these are easy issues. We'll have to work with our unions and others to make sure we're training up a workforce. Can we get the Koreans to make the big investments, in the Philadelphia shipyards, other shipyards that they've expressed an interest in? If they're going to make those investments, they want to make sure we're building ships there. Can we solve visa issues that allow Korean instructors to come in and perhaps train up that workforce? And we're not talking about Korean workers building the ships, but we're talking about Korean instructors, Japanese instructors, training up American workers to build ships. We should be able to, in a nonpartisan way, work through that. There are obviously efforts like the SHIPS Act that are nonpartisan. I'm happy to see portions of the SHIPS Act in the NDAA, so I think that is a good thing moving forward. So again, Chairwoman, thank you for the timeliness of this hearing. It's of critical national security interest, but it also is interest of American competitiveness around the world. And I look forward to hearing from the witnesses, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And today we're pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us on this very important topic. Dr. Matthew Faniole, the Vice President and Dracopoulos Chair in Innovation at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Brent Sadler, a Senior Research Fellow for Naval Warfare and Advanced Technology in the Allison Center for National Security at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. James Kim, the Program Director for the Korea Program at the Henry L. Stimson Center. I want to thank all three of you for joining us today. This committee recognizes the importance of the issues before us and is grateful to have you come before us and speak. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order for the members to ask you questions. So let me now recognize Dr. Faniole for an opening statement.
Chairwoman Kim, Ranking Member Barra, distinguished members of the committee and subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify. The views I'll express this afternoon are my own. My employer, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, does not take policy positions. China has developed the largest shipbuilding industry in recent history, which it now and increasingly wields as an instrument of national power. We just heard from Chairwoman Kim that China controls over 50% of the commercial market and the US is less than 1%. But maybe to put those figures in a little bit more perspective, a single state-owned conglomerate, the China State Shipbuilding Corporation, or CSSC, builds more commercial vessels by tonnage each year than the entire US shipbuilding industry has produced since the end of World War II. CSSC is also the principal builder of warships for the PLA Navy, and this presents both economic and national security concerns for the US and its allies, but I want to focus my comments on the national security implications. China's leaders seek to displace the US as the preeminent power in the Asia-Pacific and to project power far from its shores, and much of that ambition rests on its maritime industrial base. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen the transformation of the Chinese Navy, moving from a largely regional defense coastal force into an increasingly modern and capable fleet of over 370 ships and submarines, making it the world's largest navy. And if you look at the shipyards that are responsible for this ongoing buildup, military production often benefits and shares infrastructure with commercial operations. It's common in China to see warships being built right alongside tankers and container ships. And I've included in my testimony some satellite imagery that illustrates this. I think we might have some to be projected today potentially, and if not, that's okay. But what you'll see in the testimony is that if you look at these dual-use shipyards in China, like Jiangnan Shipyard, and there's others throughout it, you'll see container ships and military vessels peppered throughout these massive sprawling facilities. And if you look at it over time, you'll see that they're right alongside each other, or they're using the same dry docks, they're using the same gantry cranes. And this is a feature of what China has designed its shipbuilding industry to do. It seeks to fuse together both the military and commercial sides of its operations. Importantly, commercial firms also rely on China for ships. Up to 75% of the ships produced at shipyards owned by CSSC and its subsidiaries are destined for markets outside of China, many of which are U.S. allies and partners, both in Europe and Asia. And complicating that entire picture is that it is an opaque ecosystem. We don't have a lot of clarity into revenue flows or technology transfers within that system. And so what that means is that these companies who have few commercially viable alternatives outside of China because capacity is constrained and because Chinese yards can often deliver ships at a lower cost and in less time than competitors, are pouring billions of dollars into Chinese dual-use shipyards. Foreign technology is flowing into Chinese dual-use shipyards, and that collectively is helping to strengthen its maritime industrial base, which both helps on it increasing its market share, but also supports those ambitions of the PRC that I mentioned earlier, which seeks to displace the U.S. in the region. To respond effectively, the U.S. needs to get creative. My personal assessment is the U.S. shouldn't be trying to outcompete China, outbuild China in the commercial sector for commercial hulls, hull for hull. And we certainly shouldn't be trying to do that alone, but instead focusing on three interrelated lines of effort. The first is transparency. By focusing on trying to understand what those linkages are between shipyards in China, how they support foreign capital and how they support foreign orders, and how that capital funnels back into building up the maritime industrial base will help companies make better risk assessments. The second is to drive investment into high-value maritime components and systems so that the U.S. can compete with China on its own terms. And then finally, and maybe most importantly for this hearing, working with allies and partners like South Korea and Japan, as well as others. India is a new entry into the shipbuilding game as well, to both align on long-term objectives and then also to build up allied capacity at scale outside of China. China's advantages were built over the course of decades. It's not something that's going to be easily replaced, and it's not something the U.S. can address overnight. But by focusing on those three lines of effort and sustaining that focus for the years to come, the U.S. can compete from a position of strength. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Faniole. I now recognize Mr. Sadler for your opening statement.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you all today. I've got some graphics over the side on this, and they're also electronically on the hearing site. So again, good afternoon, Chairwoman Kim and Ranking Member Vera and other members of the committee. Today's discussion, the title, Charting a New Course, Encountering China's Dominance in Global Shipbuilding, is timely, to say the least, and action is urgently needed. In my 26 years as an active duty naval officer, most of it in the Pacific on nuclear submarines, in the last 6 years with Heritage Foundation, this has become a passion project. And the opening statements by the members of the committee that this is a bipartisan, it is a whole of nation endeavor. And we have partners and friends overseas that we can also draw on, like you mentioned, Japan and South Korea principally, but by all means not limited to them. My message today is we with key allies must forge a united front to China's assault on our maritime industry and national security. Today, our erstwhile adversary, the Chinese Communist Party, dominates global shipping, over 20%, shipbuilding, over 63% of deliveries, and controls a global network of over 100 strategically placed ports. On this commercial foundation, China has built the world's largest navy of over 400 modern warships, tasked with being ready to win a war over the fate of Taiwan next year. Without action and assured access to a fleet of over 1,300 commercial ships of various classes, China will be able to control the terms of trade and manipulate markets. Some of that we are already seeing. In the immediate future, sustaining a multi-year war relies on shipping to fuel wartime industry and shipbuilding to repair and replace battle losses. China knows this, and deterrence can be enhanced with a viable, independent maritime industry. The Cold War required 660 commercial ships to win against the Soviets. Today, the challenge is greater and more complex. Our response to date has been tardy, to say the least, and incomplete. But the past 2 years has witnessed a maritime awakening here in D.C. and with our allies not seen since the early 1970s. It is historic, and it is one not to be missed. This nascent national endeavor is a threat to Beijing's bottom line as well as its global aspirations. As such, this generational effort must be protected and nurtured against predatory and nefarious attacks to undermine it, some of which are already happening as we speak. Given the scale of the challenge and shared threat, allies are vital. If I can go to the next slide. Together as a united front, given our collective maritime power and capacity for innovation, China will be unable to manipulate our markets or economically coerce us. Recall how China did this in 2010 against the Japanese over rare earths, and again to us very recently, for political purposes and strategic intent. The nation is at a historical moment and unity on this issue. Legislation such as your own, the Fleets Now Act and the Ships for America Act, are welcome and needed. Actions echoed in executive orders by the President and Section 301 complaints against China make clear the path forward. These are important, but a bias to action is urgently required. Channeling our collective advantages requires a maritime group of nations modeled on the informal structures of the G7, membership to include allies like South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Greece, and perhaps even Taiwan. If you can go to the last slide. This so-called M7 would work to align regulatory and trade policies as well as positions in international organizations for common cause. Moreover, it should enable greater intellectual and skilled labor exchanges, as mentioned earlier, like naval architects, and invigorate our maritime industrial revival. A key element is also at the foreman level. For more on that in question. And China won't be idle, and here's where the threat is. Effectively countering China's expected attacks requires expanded investigative and intelligence gathering and analytical capacities across departments and agencies. The Federal Maritime Commission only had 6 agents to investigate hundreds of COVID recovery shipping irregularities. And cognizant of my time, it is time now in league with our allies to focus our energies, capital, and advantages to assess access to shipping in a crisis, to ensure that we have that, almost at a treaty-level obligation, regain competitiveness through innovation, and restore needed maritime industrial capacity. In some respects, we need to enable and nurture those captains of change and have a SpaceX kind of moment inside the broader maritime industrial base to change the terms of trade to our advantage and also seize what could be an American comparative advantage that can lead to a sustained revival of American maritime industrial might. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sadler. Let me now recognize Mr. Kim for your opening statement.
Thank you. Chairwoman Kim, Ranking Member Bera, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify. My full statement is in the record. I'll summarize its main points here where my fellow witnesses' testimony covers related grounds in more depth. I'll try to build on their work rather than repeat the same points. My reading of the Chinese leadership's public statement shows shipbuilding frequently described as an important part of China's advanced productive capacity and a pillar of its economy linked to a broader national strategy. The numbers bear this out. At the turn of the millennium, China accounted for less than 7% of compensated gross tonnage in global shipbuilding, while Japan and Korea together accounted for nearly 2/3 of the same. Today, China builds more than half of all commercial tonnage globally, while Japan and Korea's combined shares have fallen. This dominance carries 2 sets of risks. The first is economic. If there's no alternative to Chinese shipbuilders, countries have no choice but to accept China's terms for ship orders and critical components. And China's use of economic coercion in this space has already been covered by Mr. Sadler. But even if there is no deliberate coercion, concentrating a critical global supply chain in one country is a structural vulnerability, a lesson the pandemic taught us well. The second risk is national security. My fellow witnesses have documented in detail how China's military-civil fusion strategy blurs commercial and defense shipbuilding. I'd simply add that even those who come to this evidence with some caution, given the knowledge about the differences in naval and commercial shipbuilding, should still agree the risk warrants serious scrutiny rather than dismissal. If Chinese shipbuilders can squeeze out competitors globally, that capacity for the US and its allies alike shrinks with them. This is where I want to focus the rest of my time, not on the scale of the threat, which my colleagues have laid out, but on the question that ought to follow. Why haven't attempts to address this issue not resulted in more ships for us, and what stands in the way? The opportunity is very real. Over 94% of the world's ships were built in East Asia, last year, more than half in China, and the rest in Japan and Korea. These are proven and capable partners. But turning that opportunity into results requires confronting three concrete challenges, which Representative Barra has already outlined. One is labor, the other is supply chain, but the final one is demand. According to many estimates, U.S. shipyard labor turnovers runs between 20 to 30%, with first-year attrition as high as 60%. Korea's top shipbuilders each draw on thousands of local suppliers. The U.S. commercial supply chain is much smaller. And on demand, the U.S. had just 12 commercial ship orders on its books last year, compared to over 4,000 in China. Japan and Korea have each moved to help, though at different speeds. Prime Minister Takaichi has made shipbuilding central to Japan's economic security agenda, and the two governments signed a formal memorandum of cooperation last October. But translating Japan's $550 billion investment pledge into actual maritime allocation remains unresolved. South Korea has moved boldly with Hanwha's acquisition of Philly Shipyard to the MASCA initiative, dedicating $150 billion shipbuilding allocation and establishing a partnership center in Washington. We must, however, also recognize and address some real vulnerabilities. The recent U.S.-China agreement suspending Section 301 port fees shows that much of our leverage against China rests on tools that the administration can potentially trade away in a broader negotiation. A durable strategy cannot rest on only one such measure. My written testimony offers several recommendations, including converting our allies' investment pledges into binding, milestone-based commitments tied to actual demand, support for commercial shipbuilding, worker skill development, encouraging increased allied cooperation on export controls and combating Beijing's coercive tactics, and leveraging allied capacity for near-term procurement through the Maritime Action Plan's so-called bridge strategy. I'd also note that all three of us, in our written statements, working independently, arrived at a similar conclusion that there needs to be a designated accountable coordinating mechanism within the government. Revitalizing the U.S. maritime industry while countering China's market dominance is a significant challenge.